Hi guys, and welcome back to this Apex Racing Academy setup tutorial. Alex Simpson in the Indy Pro 2000, and we are going to be talking about the chassis in part 2 of this video series. If you have watched any of the other videos, you'll know this is all about just fine-tuning the setup that the coach has supplied you, how we can give you a little bit more oversteer, maybe a bit more understeer, just make the car a bit more stable in the braking zones. So just fine-tuning the setups. So I give you a bit of an explanation on what all of the setup parameters do, and then you can basically tweak the coach's setup to hopefully find a little bit more time. So with any setup, they always need to be dialed into the specific driver. Everyone's driving style is different, so there isn't a one set fits all. So while we do a great job in giving you a really good base to work from, doing some fine-tune adjustments can find you another 2-3 tenths of a second a lap, and you want to take that opportunity. Of course, it does take time to do some testing and things like that. So, if you haven't got the time, then you kind of go with it, but this is a quick way of making some quick adjustments that you think, oh, might be able to help. But like I say, yeah, you do test them before. The other thing I like to say as well is only make one setup change at a time. Don't make multiple changes at a time, because you won't know if one of them has made a positive effect and one has made a negative effect, and then you think there's no difference, and you end up just putting them both back when actually you could have found one of them, but you've just sort of ruined your opportunity because of the negative from the other. Right, so let's jump straight into it then. So the ARB on the front of the car, what does that do? Anti-roll bar, basically a soft setting gives you more oversteer. So a soft, at the moment we're on as soft as we can get with it connected. Now, disconnected anti-roll bar is even softer. So that's the softest setting you can get there, right there. And then of course you've got a stiff with the diameter, and then you've got the option between the arms as well. So a hard, that is as hard as you can get. So that's the most amount of understeer you can get from the car in terms of changing the anti-roll bar. And then yeah, this is pretty soft, but not quite as soft as having an ARB. So this is set up to give you lots and lots of front rotation, and the other way is the minimum amount of rotation. Now, what I will say as a quick sort of little disclaimer, having a stiff anti-roll bar does help change of direction. So in your medium speed and high speed corners, and you want a good responsive car to turn into those corners, a stiffer anti-roll bar can be helpful. So if you find actually you're just understeering going into those corners, but not generally, you haven't got a lack of grip or anything like that, then maybe just stiffening up the bar might just make a little difference. In the rear of the car, the anti-roll bar does the opposite effect. And the reason being is because what essentially we're doing, if we have a nice soft anti-roll bar, so again we disconnect it here, we're giving the rear end of the car more grip. So if the rear's got more grip, then suddenly the front can't pull the car around the corner. So we actually have less rotation on the car, so we have more understeer the softer the anti-roll bar is. If we were to go with a stiff anti-roll bar, so again we select the hardest options, this would take grip off the rear of the car and mean that then we have more turn through the corner, so we have more oversteer, and that's because the balance actually shifts towards the front rather than the rear, because we've taken grip off the rear end of the car. Right, let's have a quick talk about the brake bias pressure changes in this Indy Pro 2000. Now, it can be a bit confusing because you've got these master cylinders that are here, and I'm going to tell you right now to leave them alone. They are complicated in terms of how to set up, and in this basic setup video, really it's all about the brake bias pressure change here. So if you're coming into a corner and you're locking the front tyres up, you're skidding through the corner, then you need to move your bias more towards the middle of the car, so towards the 50%, so it's more even between the front and the rear of the car. If, however, it's the other way around and you're locking up the rear of the car and perhaps it's looping in those high braking zones, then you need to come forward on the brake pressure, so a higher number. Now, just to quickly explain what the cylinders do, a higher number on the front master cylinder actually gives you more rearward biased, a higher number on the rear master cylinder actually gives you a more front bias. But honestly, just use the brake pressure bias adjustments. Like I say, the coach will have got you in a relatively good place to keep the car fairly central in terms of its balance for its braking, and these fine-tune adjustments are nice and easy to understand, and you can make some quick adjustments on that. Right, let's talk about the spring rate as well as the spring perch offset and the push rod offset. And that can be the same on the rear of the car as well. So once again, like the anti-roll bar, a soft spring rate will give you more grip on the car. So more grip, more oversteer through the middle of the corner. A stiffer one will give you less grip, less rotation through that, more understeer. So if you've got a bit too much oversteer through the middle of the corners, then just go slightly up on the spring rate, and that will calm that down. If you need more mid-corner grip, if you're understeering, then you can come down on that. Now, when you do come down on the springs, so if I come down to 210, for example, you watch these ride heights, that's going to change. We're going to have reduced our front ride height. Now that, while we've given ourselves more grip, we have also given ourselves an increased rake angle on the car because the front end has dropped down, the rear stayed the same. So the car will turn more in those sort of medium and high speed corners that I talked about in the first part of the video with the aerodynamics. So you do need to make sure that you readjust these back up, and in this case just a couple of clicks on the spring perch offset brings the ride heights back to a very similar level as to what they were before. And you should always do that when changing the suspension, so you're not, again, this would be two adjustments that you've made if you just changed the spring rate here, because you've gone softer and you've changed the aerodynamic balance of the car as well. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on what the shock deflection is, but typically iRacing give us a guide to where it will be. Normally, what we try and do is when the fuel is out of the car, from our starting setup, the shock deflection should be close to 0. But iRacing doesn't always work quite well like that, but that's how they would set it, certainly in real life, for sure. You guys just do not worry about that. Let the coaches deal with that. You just do your little adjustments based on this. So you can use the spring perch offset and the push rod offset length to adjust your ride heights, just as you saw me do there. One will affect your shock deflection and your spring deflection as well. So, but like I say, really just focus on using the ride heights to get them back to where it was based on your changes you've made here. So to recap, softer, more oversteer, stiffer, more understeer. On the rear of the car, it's very similar. So a softer will give you more grip because we're shifting the balance of the car backwards. That means more understeer. Of course, we get more grip out of the acceleration zone, so that's useful for us as well in, say, slow speed stop-start tracks. So again, if we were to drop this down, we now have more grip on the car. The ride height changes ever so slightly. It went from, what was that? It was 34.8. So we drop it down. We're going to want to make sure that we get back into a very similar position. 34.5. It's probably, there we go, 34.8. So we're exactly back to where we were. Again, that keeps our aerodynamic balance. And you notice the spring deflection changed at that point in time as well. But yeah, so that's how you can fine tune to get that back. So again, softer is more understeer, stiffer is more oversteer, but softer is more grip in general. So that's how you can kind of balance, and then always remember to readjust so you're not affecting your rake angles on the car. So there's a couple of other things just to talk about. We'll do the dampers very last, but the toe-ins on the car, you want toe-in to be relatively close to 0. A more negative number, or basically a lower number, so this way, um, will give you more turn in. So whatever the coach gives you, in this particular case it's -2. If you want just a bit more turning, then you can come down on these settings here. Now be mindful when you do that. A lower setting here, you can go too far with it, but also it causes increased tyre wear. So over the stint, you'll basically burn out your tyre a little bit more and you'll go slow at the end of the stint. The optimal setting for this so that you get the best tyre wear is 0. So be mindful. Like I say, if you keep going further and further, it might be great at the start of the race, but it might be absolutely terrible at the end. On the rear, it's exactly the same principle. The optimal is 0. A minus figure, or to the left, will give you more turning. A positive will give you less turning. So if you need to stabilize the car, then you will want to go up on this setting. That'll be a little bit more stable going into the corner, but if you want a little bit more turning, well, then you can come down, and that will also help. One useful little trick is the closer you get to 0 on the turn in with, with toe in, the faster the car will also go in a straight line. It's almost like free lap time, but of course you've got to balance the car back out. It's not always possible to balance the car with a 0 towing. Sometimes it's just too sketchy on turning. But yeah, see what you can get out of it. It might be that you need to tweak this and just adjust your rake angles or somewhat. So you might go lower on the rear of the car with this toe in at 0. That will take away your turn in through the aerodynamics, but also give you a bit of straight line speed. It gains straight line speed as well because you drop the car down, so you'll have less drag. So it's you can almost get like free lap time by just doing some different tweaks, different approaches. Um, right, let's talk about the dampers then and exactly what they do. So dampers are a little bit weird in how they work. They're not, they make perfect sense, but they are the opposites, front and back. So a bump stiffness, just pretend this is the this is the road surface. You've got your front wheel here, your rear wheel here, your wing, and your front wing here. When you're coming into a corner and you brake hard, you always see the front end of the car dip down, and that is where this bump stiffness comes into play. If we have lots and lots of damping, it's trying to stop that front end from dipping down low. And if you do that, there's two things that will happen. Is that we won't have an increased amount of rake, because obviously as the front end drops down, then we shift the aero balance because the front's down, so we have a higher rake angle. Um, and we also don't allow the rear end of the car to come up. And when the rear end of the car comes up, because the car's kind of like a seesaw, then this rear tyre becomes unloaded, and when this rear tyre becomes unloaded, this means this front tyre is more loaded, so the balance shifts towards the front. So we not only do have an aerodynamic, but we also have a mechanical shift in the balance, and that will allow the car to sort of rotate through the corner. So if we have a really high setting here, we're basically saying that is more understeer going into a corner. If we have a lower setting here, that is more oversteer going into the corner. Now the rebound affects the exit of the corner, and that's because what's happening is the front of the car is coming up. The higher this setting is, the more we're trying to keep the front end pinned down. And when we do that, that keeps our rake angle in check. So a higher number will actually give us more rotation off of a corner. A lower number will allow that rake angle to pop up. It will unload this front tyre, load up the rear tyre, and then we have more understeer coming off. So if you've got oversteer coming off and you're spinning out like say yours, just it just rotates too much coming off the corner, then drop this rebound down to 0 like this, and this will help. But of course, if it's pushing like crazy, well, maybe you need to come up a little bit on the rebound just to help that. Now that's just balancing the front of the car. We're only working on the front. The rear end has the same effect, but it is in reverse. So When the front end dips down in a braking zone, the rear end comes up. So if we're going to affect the way the car turns in using the rear dampers, it is actually the other way around. So in this case, when it's coming up, it's the rebound setting. So a really soft rebound setting or zero damping will allow this rear end to poke up in the air really freely. That increases our rake angle, that unloads our rear tyre, loads up our front tyre, so again we have much more rotation. So this setting is allowing that to happen. Of course, if we've got too much oversteer going into a corner, well, we can dial that in a stiffer setting here, for example, that will try to prevent that rear end from coming up quite so much. So that will reduce our rake angle that we will have. It won't unload the rear tyre so much, so it won't load the front tyre, so we have less rotation. So that's on entry, so it's rebound on entry, where on the front it was all about the bump. Now, obviously the opposite was true, and it is the same on the rear. So the bump is all about the exit of the corner. So the exit is, um, like I say, just the opposite. So a very low damping setting is going to allow basically the car to squat down when you put the power down. And that means we're going to load this rear tyre up, rear of the car is going to drop, the rake angle is going to be reduced, so we're going to have much more understeer because we've shifted the balance towards the rear tyre instead of the front tyre. When we have a very aggressive damping, so let's say like an absolute maximum amount of damping on the bump, this will basically stop this rear end from coming down. So we're not loading up that rear tyre, we're not allowing the front end of the car to come up and be unloaded, and we're trying to keep the rake angle in check by keeping this rear end up in the air. And that will mean that we have more rotation. So a higher number on the bump is more rotation off the corner, a lower number is less rotation off the corner. Right guys, I think what I'll actually do is, because there's not an awful lot to talk about in terms of the gearbox, so I'm going to cover it right now as well. The 6th gear here, you are going to set this, you have one of two settings. How far apart are they? Well, there's not a lot of difference, is there? 267 kilometers an hour versus 262. So you're going to use that if when you're doing some testing and you're drafting somebody on the longest straight of the circuit and you find you're peaking out, so you're hitting that rev limiter, then what you need to do is come and change your gearbox here to give yourself an extra 5k so you don't peak out. Now I think you're probably going to notice that more at tracks like Spa or perhaps some ovals that we might go to, or the Nordschleife, Le Mans, somewhere like that, Daytona. We're going to definitely need to run this higher gear ratio. We're almost definitely going to peak it out. It'd be nice if we could have more settings, but I don't suppose we will. Well, maybe we will. From my race, you never know what they're going to change. Right, let's talk about the diff then. So the diff is all about locking the locking force between the two rear wheels and how that controls the car's turn in and turn off of a corner. The reason we have a diff to start off with is if we had a solid axle in the rear of the car, basically we'd only go in a straight line because the wheels travel exactly the same speed. So an absolute solid one would mean forward momentum, no turning whatsoever. That is why we have a diff in the car to allow us to go through corners. So the more locking force we have, the less the car is going to turn. The less locking force we have, the more the car will turn freely in and off of a corner. So on the settings that we've got here, you've got like a coast and you've got a drive setting. Now both of them are 55 on the drive, so it's what that's saying is both of these settings are going to have equal amounts of locking force on the way out of a corner. So there's nothing we can do with this diff ramp angle to adjust how the car exits a corner. It's always going to have the same differential setting, but we have got an entry. So coast is when we're not on the gas, but we could be on the brakes, of course. So the coast is the entry. So a higher locking number here gives you more understeer. So if we were to choose a 75, 55, this will allow the car to rotate in a little bit more freer into a corner. A 90, 55 will mean it's a little bit more understeery on the way in. Now we can fine tune this even more by using this preload setting. So if we want more locking force, then we can go up on this diff preload here. Now that actually does affect both the acceleration, so the drive, so this is a higher setting on this 55, and the ramp, the coast setting as well. So what you can have is you can have a zero preload diff 90-55, or you can have a 70-55, and then you can kind of go up on this diff setting, and that will affect both the entry and exit. Of course, the most lock-in force you can have is a 90, 55, and 110 Newton meters. I'm not kind of sure why, but we seem to be generally a bit higher on the preload settings. We tend to run with a slightly higher locked diff rather than a completely open one. The car just seems to respond better to that. But yeah, so a higher number here is more understeer, a lower number here, more oversteer or freer turn in, and again 75, 55 will give you more turn in as opposed to the 90, 55. Right, I think that's about me done for this video series now. So if you've got any questions or anything like that, you want me to cover any of the points, please just tag me in Discord and I will answer them as best I can. Thanks very much for joining the Academy. Thank you very much for listening and watching this video. I'll catch you for the next one.